this slide is really just an introductory sort of prologue to how women in the late 18th, early and mid toward late 19th centuries began to expand their abilities to represent religion publicly as teachers, leaders, ministers, and in some rare cases, priests as well, towards the 20th century. And so it sort of represents the shifting landscape of female autonomy and authority in the field of religion. And I think it's hard because I think a lot of us take for granted that this is part of our historical record. And so I thought that by revisiting the Christian tradition for just a few minutes here, to kind of put it in the context of how significant the shift was in the especially in the 19th century, from where it began. And so let's do that. I'll start with a juxtaposition of two quotes that we've already seen before, but they're now a little bit more relevant for this topic. The creedal formula in Galatians 3:28, which you've seen before, with its pairing of binary relationships of slave and free, Jew and Greek, and male and female. In the context of its appearance in antiquity, this was a fairly radical sentiment that allowed for some challenges to be made to the relationships that were already predominant. So you have a sort of general norm that male dominated over female, free people dominated over slaves, and of course the assumption was that within a Jewish world, Jews would dominate over Greeks, at least ideally. And yet at the same time, on the ground, none of these relationships were actually actualized or realized in a society that would correspond to them. So as long as the ideal was in Christ, it could be a sort of parallel reality or a parallel utopia that didn't really affect how society actually operated. It was not a radical call to revolt or revolutionize Roman society. Rather, it was an alternative reality that could exist simultaneously to the status quo. Nonetheless, I mean, it's really hard to not accept the fact that it kind of planted a seed of equality, the ideal of equality, that could eventually be attempted or further developed. And so, when we turn to the Declaration of Independence, we see a kind of similar sentiment. I don't think it's the same, but it's a similar sentiment of equality. And again, there are limitations to the equality. It's an ideal, it's a utopian ideal born out of the Enlightenment that all human beings share a sort of early equality, created equal, so it's a religious vision. And at the same time, it was not actualized in the society at that time, nor is it today. So even though we recognize the high-level ideal of all men being created equal, it did not include women. Women did not have equal rights. It did not include indigenous people. They did not have recognition of rights. Nor did it include those who were slaves. So it's a kind of qualified equality because it recognizes that they may have been created as such, but they do not actually enjoy that in current conditions. So, just a little bit of a positive tension in the air. So an ideal of equality can coexist with its failure to be realized or recognized. When it comes to women in particular, the Christian tradition has a 2,000-year history of dominance over women. And so I'll just briefly go into that for a moment because I wanted to start on a positive note, like this is an ideal within the tradition, that male and female can somehow be one or somewhat equal in status within Christ. But then when we turn to the texts of the New Testament that become scripture, within Christian tradition, we see a rather different sentiment expressed, where the subordination of women to men is made sacred. It's made into scripture, sort of the word of God, so to speak. So in 1 Corinthians 14, which is a controversial passage because it's not even 100% clear that this is Paul actually speaking these words rather than someone imitating Paul. Regardless, within the Christian tradition, this is accepted as scripture and Pauline, therefore it is authoritative, and it rather emphatically puts the female in a subordinate role to the male, particularly if there's a marriage in place, right? So the husband is the head of the household, and the woman is subordinate and subservient and secondary to the man. I don't know how it makes you feel, but it kind of at least sets in place an assumption that women have no role of authority in religion, not in Christianity anyway. And if they do have some authority, it's not in the church environment. So they're not allowed to speak up, they're not allowed to be leaders or the public spokespeople or representatives of such. They are to be subordinated to their male partners. So, it would seem like that would be it for the female in Christianity, unless there were circumstances or changing conditions that could allow for the situation to be improved or corrected.
Do you think that, like, possibly the biggest force of creating gender inequality could be Christianity?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a interesting question. Yeah, I think that's good. Yeah,
Possibly.
it's
Like,
certainly.
number 2, number 1. Who takes rank 1? Who takes rank 2?
Oh, what do you mean?
Like in world powers that have like created gender.
Well, I think it's fair to say that Roman society gets the credit for that. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think Christianity conforms.
Immortalizing that Roman.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Thank you.
Okay. So what would be those changing conditions that would be able to alter or modify the role of women in the 19th century especially? Like how does Christianity accept the change that now women will start becoming publicly recognizable as leaders, authoritative spokespeople? Yes.
I read that they were seen as more pious because they were inside the home, so they were not as less temptations inside the house, and freedom from the.
No, I like that sentiment. Yeah, the sentiment, but they're still in the house.
Yes.
I guess it's not as simple as I'm just wearing pants. Right?
Yeah.
Does
Yeah.
this have anything to do with, I mean, this is, I know, somewhat early, but I know some of the thoughts for suffrage and or even prohibition that was led by a women's movement.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So it sort of overlaps with interests. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
where again, they're moving out, they're still thought of inside the domestic sphere, but they're also starting to move away from it as well and becoming more public about not necessarily even women's rights, but purity and rights in general of, living up to the message of Christianity.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, so we're kind of skirting around the edges there. So yeah, absolutely right. I just wanted to start by saying, there's a sort of foundational assumption in Christianity of women's places in the home, taking care of the house and the children, and that her job is not to intervene in religious affairs very much. And that was pretty much the way things remain for quite some time. And yet in America, there seems to have been a little bit more circumstantial elements that lend themselves to expanding the limitations of that horizon. Freedom of religion, the Great Awakening, mostly in the public environment, and the attraction of women to religion, which is somewhat inexplicable perhaps, but we'll start there. Okay, so changing roles for women, which culminate in the 20th century and attaining the vote, 1920. So we start seeing these shifts, but they're shifts from a traditionalist model. So these are not just coming out of nowhere. The changing roles of women take time because of the sort of strength of the model that has been 2,000 years in the making. So we'll say, like, historically speaking, women's roles were relegated or delegated to the home, which was the Roman patriarchal model, that the men's world was outside in the public polis, and the women's role was in the household, taking care of home affairs. And yet, there's always been a sort of working, it's really hard because I don't like demonstrating gender bias, but there's always been a tendency to think of women as being more religious, more interested in religion than men, more attracted to spirituality, and there are probably good positable reasons for that. So without being like stereotypical, one could observe that women tend to gravitate more to religious life than men. And I hate kind of having to hem and haw about that, but I think it's true. So more inclined to it, and so numerically stronger in terms of participation and devotion and commitment. So that's a strength that we might be able to build on. So within the home, women's roles were, or at least the presence of a woman, could be seen as extending toward the spiritual, pious, or devotional life of the house. But always based on a kind of patriarchal model where women were under the men. So there's some tension there that needs to get continually worked out. And in Christianity especially, because of the sacrificial nature of the tradition and the model of self-sacrifice, both in Jesus' life and in the role of martyrdom, that was also then transferred to the female's role as well. The female sacrifices for the family, for the husband, offers themselves up, in a sense, for the good of their whole. So that's another sort of cultural assumption that works in Christianity, that the woman's role is to offer their lives for the benefit of the male and the family and the community as well. And yet, as we've seen, there are biblical resources to challenge the model that would assume this domination, subordination dynamic or binary. And one of them is the key text of Galatians 3:28, which we could build on and say, well, maybe there's a seed of equality in the Christian tradition which would allow for women to be able to express themselves more equally and freely within the religious environment. You could also appeal to texts like Genesis 1, where it says male and female are created in the image of God, therefore not assuming any subordinate role for the female. And of course, in an atmosphere of freedom of religion, one might also experiment and expand on the horizons of possibilities there as well. So there are some converging factors that allow for us to see that women were able to embrace these social, political changes and slowly, hesitatingly begin to embrace more public roles as preachers and ministers. And once one starts and successfully begins, others follow the lead, and it becomes a trajectory or a momentum. So, Joshua has already mentioned that there are some overlapping interests that women share naturally with other social causes, and so it becomes sort of strength in solidarity. Any group in and of itself is not as strong unless they join forces with other groups. So one of the strengths of the women's movement from the 19th century forward was aligning itself with other social causes to sort of generate this momentum and strength. And so we start seeing these overlapping interests in women's rights, culminating really in a new religious vision for women. So one could start by saying, for example, that within the Protestant tradition, reform is embedded, it's inherent within the model of religion. That there was some kind of noble utopian equality at the beginning, and we could maybe resurrect it, revive it, restore it, reform it. So that becomes a kind of dynamic model of religion. Like, we're not stuck in the present. We can go back to the past, find the best parts of it, and then rebuild the present and the future through it. So that reform paradigm lends itself to changing religion, right? Especially if you have a utopian ideal of what it was in the past. So you could work that and make reform part of the future. So that's one way to look at it. Reform as a kind of Christian duty, a kind of ethical obligation to be true to the faith as it is conceived. We start seeing parallel movements, for example, in Reform Judaism. And of course, the word reform is taken as a kind of nod to the Protestant tradition as well. Right? So Reform Christianity is Protestantism. Reform Judaism also lends itself to empowering and strengthening women's roles within Judaism. So these are parallel developments in Protestant Christianity and in Reform Judaism, both embracing the changing circumstances of the Enlightenment to allow for more freedom of expression within the religious sphere, even if it means changing the religion. And in terms of the overlapping interests that begin to attract and gather momentum, we start seeing women's rights being promoted alongside more public education opportunities, the temperance movement, and of course, the most important of all, the abolitionist movement. So freedom and liberty become kind of a clarion call for the age. And groups that feel oppressed, the African American movement, women's liberation movement, they are natural allies.
So imagine if there hadn't been like hordes of people being like, you know, I'm against abolition, or that's the alcohol ban, right?
Yeah.
And like, you know, against like, and imagine if they hadn't imported all those slaves and stuff. It's like, ooh, interesting. Like, you know, what if we didn't like have like those like 2,000 years before it didn't have enough momentum to like, you know, spark something. It's kind of interesting to think, oh, this actually are related in something.
Yeah, it's like you need oppression.
Oh.
You need oppression for a liberation
But
movement
I guess,
to push,
yeah.
to push back against. Yeah. So, when religion is identified as the cause of oppression, or suppression, or marginalization, then the religion can be changed. And in dynamic religious traditions like Protestantism or Reform Judaism, modifications can be made within those religious traditions, allowing for sort of this expansionist horizon. So criticism of religion then becomes part of reform of religion. Right? It's just a natural extension of the principle. And of course, if we were to push this forward a little bit, we would see when you criticize a religious establishment, you're going to get pushback from it. Right? So this becomes the push-pull of change. Like you push forward for a positive change, then those who are threatened by the change will push back, and the cycle will continue. So by the turn of the 19th century, the Woman's Bible was published in 2 volumes, which sort of spearhead the women's movement towards a more radical critique of the Bible, really specifically focusing on all of the passage in the Bible where women are narratively described or represented as inferior or subordinate to the male. And even though this isn't a work of critical biblical scholarship, it sets the ball rolling for the allowance of biblical criticism of or a criticism of the Bible in its representation of women. So kind of major turning point, classic in the women's liberation movement, because it's now targeting probably the most central cluster of problematic texts that maintain the status quo. Just for a light moment. Fast forwarding into the 1960s. Just, I'm sorry if this offends, but. So, I just thought it was funny, I'm sorry. But it's because by the late 1960s, the momentum for women's rights and liberation and equality, so to speak, could be an advertising slogan. This became a kind of catchphrase of the counterculture, where women's liberation could be symbolized by their ability to be targeted for a cigarette brand. Right? So the idea that you've come a long way, baby, I'm thinking of it in terms of 2,000 years. I'm not thinking of it in terms of the 1960s, right? So, and in that sense, I think it has a little bit of traction. Right? So the idea that women can now share in the freedom to smoke without, being maligned or as such.
They're kind of seen as like possible purchasers, having purchasers.
Yeah, it's pure advertising, trying to hook women on the market. But
It makes me think of lack of representation in media nowadays, how they do it through commercials and inserting them in like these scenarios.
yeah,
And it's like, well, is that real life? Or is that really equality that we're achieving through
yeah.
simply putting a commercial up there?
And it's kind of like performative equality. Like you get to feel like you're being part of the status quo, but it's it's an illusion as such. Yeah.
What's interesting about what the standard at that time, think of what the Marlboro.
The Marlboro Man. Yeah,
Exactly.
the Cancer Man.
So again, this is the standard image for basically the white male at the time, where it's like,
Yeah.
this is you, buddy. You know what I mean? Where it's like, if you're not, then you might as well be smoking Virginia Slims.
Yeah. The woman's brand. Not those fat cigarettes that men smoke. Yeah, I like that. Anyway, a light moment. I'm not trying to make too much out of this. But if we were to fast forward, this is where it's going. Like a countercultural, symbolic equality of women and the pushback that comes from it. On another note, the desire within the liberal Protestant camp to try to reform Christianity comes to another expression, which has now become sort of the evangelical, sort of one of their trademarks. What would Jesus do? Not a question I ask myself very often, but still, it kind of emerges as a response to conservatism and introduces an important principle within liberal progressive Christianity. The idea that there is some sort of common denominator that could revitalize or reform society if and only if we were true and committed and faithful to its message. So, In His Steps is just a sort of like throwaway novel of the late 19th century that posits that it's a utopian fictional experiment of a town in the Midwest that decides, because they're frustrated with their lives, what would it look like if we all obeyed the golden rule? So if we all followed the quintessential teaching of Jesus just for a month or so, what would life look like? And this becomes sort of like a early sign of liberal progressivism in America. So the idea that if we were to actually do what Jesus said, then it would change our relationships to each other and to society, and we could essentially build or restore or rebuild the kingdom of God on earth. So this becomes the sort of, like I said, a kind of clarion call for progressivism. And it's taken on a life of its own. I don't think it's the liberal slogan anymore. I think this is an evangelical slogan. And a bracelet. Yeah. Yeah. I've never seen it, but yeah.
I have seen it.
You have seen them?
Yeah, and I didn't know what it meant because it just had like the
WWJD.
And I was like, oh, like what's that bracelet?
Well, this is where it comes from, and they probably don't, most people probably don't know it. And it wasn't an evangelical slogan when it was first coined. It was basically a call to change society by just obeying what Jesus perhaps, but certainly what the progressive movement would affirm as a universal ethic. Just don't be shitty to other people because you probably prefer not to be that way, treated that way yourself. So, yeah, go
What
ahead.
is this?
1896, I think. Yeah, 1896. A liberal movement. But it gives birth, or at least it brings to expression a principle of the era, and I'll just focus on that next. The desire to change society. You've seen it in reform movements, you see it in the women's movement, we just saw it in the desire to have a social experiment based on the Golden Rule. And by the turn of the 19th century, early 20th, we start seeing what we look back on as the emergence of the social gospel. The desire to make Christianity an active, pragmatic, and I guess revolutionary force in a way in American society. So the social gospel is just a sort of gloss term that we use to describe an era that was optimistic, forward-looking, progressive, liberal, and socially oriented. So that the idea was to make Christianity relevant in American society, not some abstract, ethereal ideal that one waits for heaven for, but rather to build the kingdom in the present. If you recall the millennial tradition, millennialism, this would fit very nicely within the post-millennial tradition, meaning that the Christian's obligation is to actually create the conditions of the kingdom of God on earth now, rather than wait for some miraculous intervention to bring it into being. So the social gospel was motivated by these ideals from a Christian perspective, and applying those ideals to the ills of society. Now we have a full house. You guys missed your midterms. I'm so sorry. But come see me afterwards and I'll have them back to you. So, progressive era, sort of piggybacking off of the ideal of evolution that's in the air, like that we're evolving, we're developing, we're growing, we're progressing, and using the ideal or principle of evolutionary progress and sort of trying to actualize it within society with some Christian inspiration. So we start seeing like labor movements, unions, educational principles, the women's movement, making alliances with the abolitionist movement, with working conditions for children and for the poor, for the marginalized, for different communities. And it's all seen under this umbrella of doing good for the sake of society, which is a reflection of the Christian ideal. So an early desire, not socialism, but a desire to use Christianity in a sense, or allow Christianity to serve as a revolutionary principle.
Question?
Yeah.
When did, looking at all this compared to like the prosperity gospel, when did ideas like that start coming about? Is sort of a reaction?
Yeah, I mean,
progressive, like
the prosperity gospel is a little bit more aligned with that New Thought tradition that we saw the other day. Like, if you think powerful, affirmative thoughts of wealth and abundance, you'll draw it to you.
sounds like The Secret.
It's totally The Secret.
Okay.
But 100 years before.
Yeah, okay.
So The Secret's just a modern version of New
I
Thought.
see.
Yeah. Like, if
But
you
it's
think
straight
it,
up
so
new
it shall be.
thought, yeah. It's straight up new thought, though.
Yeah, it's kind of like magic.
Got it.
Like attracts like.
I see.
So if you have the power of the mind working for you, then you just think what you want, and then you draw it to you.
It was like lazy magic. So you don't have to do any of the rituals or
No, you don't do
Maybe it's
rituals.
more-
Yeah, it's
yeah.
the easy way out.
it's the
You
easy
just
magic.
think thoughts,
Yeah.
and you draw those realities to you.
So again, it does have an earlier foundation.
Oh yes, yes. New Thought is part of it's an alliance with Christian Science, religious science, science of mind. There's a lot of overlapping movements that play with this. Yeah, but-
Would it be a stretch to say that some of it could be biblical, like asking you shall receive?
That's a good one. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Within Christian Science, for
Yeah.
sure. Like the power of prayer. If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can tell a mountain to move and it will move. So it's kind of like making some very wild claims about what's possible. Yeah, but you're right. It's a good point.
While also ignoring all the things they say about how difficult it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom.
Yeah, so the prosperity gospel piggybacks off New Thought, and it makes preachers quite lucrative careers, right? Because they're getting
And I suppose they need to explain that somehow, of how you're doing so much better than the rest of the congregation. You know
that's a
what I mean?
good point. Yeah.
You have an airplane and a brand new car, you know.
Well, like Bill Maher says, no, I'm just kidding. No stand-up. But he had a good line about that. But you have to watch Religionless to get it. It's really not good.
I've seen
Have you seen it?
Yeah.
Okay, no more private conversation.
Sure. Fair.
Okay, saving souls, society, and execution of the kingdom of God. Okay, yes. So basically, what we're seeing here is the intimations of an attempt to make Christianity sounds kind of crass to say useful, but idealized and actualized and realized, and for its very best qualities: equality and compassion and care of the poor and the marginalized and the sick, the things that Jesus did. And turn them into the goods for the whole society. If everyone acted like that, everyone treated each other that way, we would have a revolutionary movement on our hands. So social justice, social gospel issues kind of take a back seat during the World War I and II eras, and by the turn of the middle of the 20th century, we're in new conditions where we're fighting a Cold War against Russia. And as we saw, religion was once again useful for a very different agenda, which was conflict-driven and a desire to polarize the atheistic Soviet Union with the devout God, under God of America. But nonetheless, I think like the social element of the social gospel lends itself to social justice movements as well. And it never really goes away, it just changes forms. And the civil rights movement then allows for those same alliances in the 20th century to sort of regroup and build another trajectory of momentum. And so, as a sketch, I wanted to introduce this again in the context of social change. Where the ideals of Christianity are being combined with the American context to create a new sort of ferment of something that could be different. That I don't think Christianity in and of itself would have been able to sustain. So once again, we have revival and rationalism leading the way for change, not one or not the other, but both. And the civil rights movement is a perfect expression of that, I guess, hybrid reality that we're living in. Even the name, civil rights movement, like the term civil war, I think it obscures or it obfuscates the religious dimensions of these movements. The Civil War was also a religiously motivated war based on biblical authority, and the civil rights movement was inspired by religious vision. not simply democratic ideals. Religious vision. Martin Luther King was a preacher who used the Bible liberally, peppering biblical allusions all throughout his political speeches, resonating with a Christian audience, able to hear and remember the ideals and the visions that he juxtaposed with quotations from the Declaration of Independence and allusions to a failed promise of equality that was still on the horizon for him in the future. So just a brief walkthrough of some milestones. Despite the changes of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, segregation is a continual problem throughout the 20th century. There are legal modifications as such in the Supreme Court's rulings. They're not very well enforced on the ground, leading to conflicts and direct confrontations between the government and the South. And within this maelstrom, Martin Luther King Jr. steps in as a new PhD graduate and applies his oratory skills to the civil rights movement. Now, where this intersects with religion is interesting for me because he's a theologian by training, but also has a BA in sociology, so he wants to combine his two interests in religious reform and social good of our society. And it's sort of just like he's in the right place at the right time, and he gets a little bit recruited into the movement. And because of his charisma and his education and his skills, he's able to kind of galvanize a movement under his wing and under his religious vision, I would also say. And his ministry is so successful that it leads to ultimately to the Civil Rights Act in 1964. On his assassination, Martin Luther King Jr. was on the verge or on the cusp of tackling the two greater evils of American society that he had identified. One was the widespread phenomenon of poverty, and the other was the Vietnam War. Both systems that he identified as horrific engines of violence in American society. And what seems to have galvanized Martin Luther King Jr. In his dreams of equality and his political vision and in his ability to actualize his efforts was the principle that he formalized as nonviolent resistance. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about that phenomena as it emerges in American society, middle of the 20th century, as a religious vision, at least as a partly religious vision. So, two sets of bullet points here for your consideration or your memory. Nonviolent resistance is both a religious vision and a political strategy for us to consider. And it is something that one could make an argument that it was not perhaps invented by Jesus, but it uses Jesus as a sort of figurehead of inspiration. Jesus, known for a kind of nonviolent ethic that he actualizes politically in his ministry, as he ends up being politically executed. And then the ideals that Jesus is remembered for find their way into the Gospel of Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount, and then inspire Mahatma or Mohandas Gandhi, who kind of creates a political experiment using those ideals, and then that directly inspires Martin Luther King Jr. to follow in the same footsteps, but this time, instead of liberating India from British rule, he thinks that he could use those same principles to liberate American society from racism and segregation. So it's a religious vision that we can track or trace historically from its inception, 2,000 years ago to its political realization in the 20th century. And apparently, it works. I say that because I'm not a particularly strong advocate, I don't do it myself, but I think it has a very good track record. So I just want to walk through the two sets of points. The first set on top are 4 of Martin Luther King's principles of philosophy. This is, in a sense, like a shorthand version of his philosophical position of life, which of course overlaps with his ideal of the nonviolent resistance. So the goal of life is reconciliation with those who you're in conflict with, rather than conflict itself. Right? Conflict is a temporary process through which reconciliation is the goal. So that's number 1. So it's a overarching ideal of unity. The purpose of this resistance is not simply to create conflict, but to counter, challenge, or defeat injustice. So it's goal-oriented resistance. So rather than simply just being chaotic or anarchic. So that's number 2. Number 3, a very Christian concept that we've seen also used to describe women's roles as aligned with suffering. And also imitative of Christ, because Christ is thought to have redeemed society through suffering. So as with Martin Luther King and with Gandhi, voluntary suffering is an act of resistance, but it's also transformative because it will redeem the society that it's dedicated to. Kind of a hard pill to swallow. What does it look like on the ground?
Looks like the water hoses and like dogs and horrible.
Yeah, it looks like voluntary acceptance of abuse.
On that point, I think Martin Luther King said that nonviolent resistance is optimal, but if there is violent resistance or riot, you have to accept the horrible consequences for it. So that goes to show that that's something terrible can happen if it doesn't happen.
That's great. So, it's probably the most controversial area of the movement. The idea that if you want to instill or inspire or instigate social change, you must follow this particular Christian perspective. That you must embrace suffering because suffering is the key to divine redemption or divine transformation. So the same way that Jesus is held as an ideal who embraced suffering voluntarily and therefore atoned for collective sin, so did both Gandhi and King embrace suffering, willing suffering, as a way of redeeming society. But in slightly different ways. It's not like they said, oh, if we die for our cause, we will absolve sin of others. I think it's a little different. I don't know if anyone has like a working idea. How does suffering, voluntary suffering in this particular political context work, as opposed to the religious vision that Jesus is regarded as holy? Sure, take it.
Yeah, I think in this instance, it's very different because we have television cameras now, and people can see it. And I think that actually affected, talking to like my parents who remember a lot of this, I asked them, I'm like, they grew up in the South even, and like, how did that sort of break some of that? And much like the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, they got to see it firsthand for the first time rather than hear an account. Where it's similar to the Bible, you can hear about the suffering of Jesus,
Right.
but when you actually see people being attacked just for the color of their skin or trying to gain more rights for some reason, it has a much more profound impact of human suffering that it could be you, might not why not do that? So
Good point.
I think the visuals of it have a lot to do with it.
And the visuals, like sort of inspiring some sentiment in those who witness.
Like, this needs to change, this can't be America.
Right, yeah, that's a good point, yeah.
So as cliche as it sounds, I would say like the image of the nonviolent resistance is actually like all about empowerment of like the resistor, if you will, like because like if you think about it, like the biblical teaching, like to turn the other cheek
Yeah.
when your enemy strikes, that's actually a sign of like incredible strength and power, and also like kind of a dismissal of like any kind of threats and military action that wants to eliminate like your movement. Like it just has this like ideal image of someone who is unmovable in the face of horror and threats.
Yes, you're right, I mean, the way you put it sounds really awesome, you know, like this noble ideal of being able to withstand suffering or punishment, punitive measures. Yeah.
Well, if you're absorbing violence without giving it back, then you're avoiding conflict. Civil war, like
Yeah.
30 years later, so the way to achieve equality without going into like conflict.
Yeah. I mean, the way you put it, it's like you're neutralizing the impact of the violence coming at you. Yeah. Sure.
I would say like if you are able to withstand the stuff like the torture that is enacting the suffering on yourself, it kind of like strengthens the like cause that you're doing it for. So it's like if
Yeah.
you put yourself through these, if you put yourself in a situation to like get harmed and you're able to like withstand that, it like shows people that like what you're fighting for is worth it. It's like
Yeah.
why would you put yourself through something if you don't fully believe in it? Like why would you willingly like let yourself get hurt?
That's right.
So
Really good
it's like
point.
it's not like a empowering thing that it shows
Yeah.
that there's a basis to what one believes in.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I mean, I would even strengthen your position by saying that's probably what launches Christianity so successfully. It's like people publicly witnessing the conviction of faith in Christian martyrdom. Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, it's a sign that they really mean what they believe in. Yeah. So yeah, all of the above. And I just think it's really interesting that as a strategy, nonviolent resistance does work because it doesn't fight back when you're attacked. And as long as it's disciplined, I think it really is a very effective tool. But I always like to focus on that Christian element of voluntary suffering because it's not an intuitive gesture. It's not something you take. It doesn't come naturally to me. Just look at me on the 405 one day, and I will promise you will not see nonviolent resistance. But nonetheless, you know, as a strategy and as a tool and as a kind of like method, it's very powerful when I've seen it applied in other conditions. I don't think LA is fair as a judge for this, putting it into practice. And then the last point, I guess I'll linger on for a moment, is MLK's vision of the world, which he called the universe in his philosophy, rather than God. Right? So even though he's a Christian preacher, when he spoke about his belief system, his philosophy, he did not use God talk or God language. And I guess I would ask you just to clarify for me, why would he prefer universe talk as opposed to God talk?
And it encompasses like every foods, whether you like what you believe in is identified as God but like not. So it's not like this idea of like what we see like in America with like under God.
Right.
There's heavy emphasis on like that idea of like Christian nationalism that's also that can be like perverted.
Sure.
So it helps people kind of align themselves with like people because they feel that they're being included.
Yeah, exactly. Really well said. Yeah. So as inclusive as possible. The language is inclusivity. If you start talking God, you're going to alienate people who don't subscribe. But if you use more neutral language, you will be able to expand the population and the participation in the movement. So yeah, number 1, 2, 3, 4. I think there were a few others, but those are the ones I like. Or at least, and then the second set of bullet points is really just MLK's method of nonviolent resistance. So how does he put things into practice? The 4 steps are things that he taught and he required for all participants in strikes, demonstrations, sit-ins, boycotts, etc. So the first is collecting facts of an alleged injustice, sort of verifying that something is wrong, either in a law or in a custom or a practice or an institution. Second step is an attempt to negotiate with the powers that be to see if something can be altered or modified. If that fails, then you undergo self-purification, which is sort of equivalent to the third step of voluntary suffering. So self-purification means you prepare yourself to be harmed. Meaning that because it doesn't come naturally, you have to train to not retaliate when someone attacks. This is the dynamic principle behind Gandhi and MLK's effectiveness. Only through training would you be able to resist retaliation.
What would this training look like?
Actual mock-up trials of striking, hitting, practice runs, which could be very threatening to your sense of self. And so if you experiment and you tempt it for a little while, you're ready for when it becomes real. Yeah. So any athlete knows that you have to train, for practice. You have to practice, otherwise it won't work.
They had like lines though, where it was like, you don't die for this, right?
No,
or
no,
did they
no.
literally
No,
say, all right,
you're
so
practicing
I-
the run. But it did include getting slapped or getting harmed. But you know it's coming, so you can kind of brace for it. Yeah, but it's a very effective way of preparing for real world conditions. Yeah.
Is it like verbal
Oh yeah,
practice?
oh absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's one of the great strengths is that there was a training program. There are other movements that have tried to utilize this method that aren't quite as systematic, and then they're not as effective. And if you have a movement that does try to use nonviolent resistance but doesn't do the training, forget it. And I will not bring up last year's camps.
Keep thinking about
How do you think about it? See, I don't have to do the talking, it's great.
that. Well, no, when this subject, I kept thinking how the movement wasn't able to achieve that.
Yeah, and there's myriad reasons for it, and it's an ongoing dynamic, so we haven't seen the end of that either. But nonviolence is a touchy area because it's fragile, and all it takes is 1 or 2 people to ruin it, and that's always a possibility. So one of the things that MLK was insistent on was these training programs. So you weren't allowed to participate in a strike or a demonstration unless you had a sort of card-carrying member of the training. And then the last step, just to be quick about it, is direct action. So you don't actually do anything unless you've already gone through it, and then you're prepared for the retaliation or the response, and you create these performative actions that aren't necessarily important in and of themselves because they're symbolic. They represent enacted power and an ability to harness a group for effective change. So they're staged, they're performative, but they're designed to show power and actualize that. And so the union of the power put in and harnessed and funneled and focused is a very effective tool when you want an institution to change, because it's very hard to resist that focused energy. So that's one religious vision that inspires political change in America in the 20th century, using the religious language, the religious tradition, religious sentiments and ideals inherited from Christianity, we could then look at another parallel movement, also attractive to the same community or adjacent communities of African Americans. And I'll use only as an example the movement led by, spearheaded in the late 1960s by Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam. We have not talked about Islam very much, and I will postpone some of that until the 9/11 survey. But for now, I want to at least glance or focus for a moment or two on this other sort of approach to change, and a willingness perhaps to embrace a slightly different approach than the nonviolent resistance of the Christian tradition. So this is a really interesting movement that should be included within the New Religious Movement survey that we'll be getting into next. But for now, we could just sort of like link it up to the fiery foment of the late 1960s countercultural era, where everything is in sway and in play. So picture it as Malcolm X, major spokesperson for this movement, which emerges in the 20th century as an alternative for African Americans to Christianity. And it's a kind of secretive origin, because we don't know very much about the person who actually founds the ideology, sort of a mysterious character, but it's embraced by charismatic leaders who kind of create a very, I don't even know how to describe this, but it's distinctive, and it's interesting and even fascinating in intellectual history. The idea that African Americans should be Muslims because Islam is the religion of Africa, and Jesus himself was black. And so for an African American to embrace Christianity is tantamount to, or parallel to, an indigenous person embracing Christianity. It's the religion of the slave master, the colonial settler. And so there's a rejection of these Christian pacifist ideals and an embrace of a more aggressive form of religion, which seems more compatible with the actual political situation and conditions of the African American community. It's aggressive. It's an ability to not be cowed by pacifism as a way of like silencing criticism of the dominant religion or the society. And it embraces, at least in potential, a willingness to use violence as a way of countering social injustice and racism. So there's a lot of names here, I get that. Wallace Fard Muhammad is understood to be God, not unlike the way Jesus perhaps would be understood as an incarnation of God. Elijah Muhammad is the leader of the movement, Nation of Islam, and he takes the role of messenger. This is not traditional Islam. He says, as far as this has nothing to do with, in some ways, with a traditionalist view of Sunni or Shiite Islam, but it's a mutation of such.
Would you say they're still using the Quran, or
Sorry?
are they still using the Quran, or?
Of course, well, yeah, they would still appeal to the scriptures of Islam, but it's such a deviant form of the tradition that it's almost like not even mentioning them in the same breath would be fair in some ways. It's more or less a heretical version of the tradition. So Elijah Muhammad takes Malcolm X under his wing in prison, or he's at least converted in prison, and he becomes, because of his charisma and his oratory and his articulate skills, he becomes a spokesperson for the movement. He uses language that's intentionally provocative, calling white people devils, and countering Martin Luther King's nonviolent ideals as more or less tokenism that's cowing to Christian expectations. So these are two parallel voices in the late 60s mid to late 60s. Both speaking for and on behalf of the African American community, one using Christian ideals of pacifism and resistance, the other using Islam and an ideal that is more compatible with violence in defense of righteous cause. So, two parallel movements. Ultimately, Malcolm X is assassinated just as Martin Luther King is assassinated. In this context, Malcolm X is assassinated for leaving the Nation of Islam and joining the Sunni tradition as a traditionalist Muslim, and thereby rejecting some of the more radical, heretical views of the nation's vision of the world. And so I think I have 3 minutes, so I'll just end on one note, which we'll be able to pick up next time. And that at least takes us into one of my favorite eras, which is the counterculture. The 1960s are revolutionary in so many ways, and many of the ideals and ideas and movements overlap with religious content, and so we'll be able to move forward from this point on, taking a look at some of how these ideas and ideals intersect with each other and give birth to our sort of postmodern era. So for now, I've just made a list. And the list includes things that we now consider more or less mainstream, but in the 60s, these were converging elements that allowed for a movement to be called counterculture. Right? So you assume that there's a status quo dominant culture, and then you counter it. But over time, elements of counterculture become absorbed in culture. So they're no longer counter. So we have to go back in time to actually recognize the fact that these were counterculture at that time. All right. Let's try it again. Emma? There. Megan? Can I just pass that to Sherelle? Tell me if I'm mispronouncing this. The last name's Arango. Thank you. Shazra? Oh. You. Caesar? Sophia? Sarah William. Cool. Let me just hand that to you.